I'm Michael Ryan. I'm director of the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia. And some of you are probably wondering, what the devil does the library have to do with this conference? Why the library? Well, I'll tell you. The library, in fact, is the very raison d'etre for this conference, because the conference marks the acquisition of the papers of Erica Jong by Columbia last fall. An enormous, huge collection of valuable, unique material documenting the life and career of an extraordinary person in the 20th century. We will begin organizing this collection soon, and I hope it will be available for use in the not-too-distant future. It is a truly, singularly rich trove of material for scholars, and I know that generations of students and researchers will benefit from it. Erica, it's wonderful having you back with us as a Barnard graduate, as a Columbia alum, and now as a resident of the Rare Book and Manuscript Library. Welcome. I should also add that Erica has given us non-exclusive rights to fully, as they say in legalese, exploit the archive. So one of the really important things that we'll be doing over the years is looking for creative ways to exploit the archive on the web. So stay tuned, and coming soon on your screen may be some very interesting documents. Earlier this week, I had the privilege of attending, as perhaps some of you did, a talk by a noted scholar from Stanford, Estelle Friedman, and Barnard alumna, who reminisced about the importance of being at Barnard and in the Columbia community in the late 1960s during the times of trouble. And Estelle's title was Coming of Age at Barnard, and the talk was about what it meant to come of age in the late 60s. And she focused on three aspects of coming to age. One was a question of race and ethnicity. What does it mean to be a Jew? What does it mean to be a Jew in New York? How does one deal with, as a Jew, other ethnic groups, etc.? Two, issues of authority, politics, and the like. And three, issues of sexuality and gender. I'm not going to repeat her talk, but what she said basically in a capsule was that Barnard did have an extraordinary impact on her life in terms of the first two, but not so much the third. She exited Barnard as she entered Barnard in terms of issues of gender and sexuality. And it wasn't until after Barnard, in the 70s, in the full bloom, when the feminist movement was in full bloom, that she began reading, talking, meeting, going to groups, and learning slowly that there too was a zone of choices that she could make. And I think, I thought during Estelle's remarks, and think so today, that a more perfect introduction to this conference today could not be found than Estelle's own autobiography. I'm always struck, but I'm never surprised by the ways in which the title of the book about which we're meeting today has embedded itself into our collective consciousness, to the point where fear of flying serves as a trope for everything from the TSA to editorial columns in the New York Times about Eliot Spitzer's zipper problem. Clearly, we are on to something today. And with that, because you didn't come to hear me, I'm happy to turn the afternoon over to my co-sponsor, my co-collaborator, Professor Marianne Hirsch of Columbia's Department of English and Comparative Literature and director of the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, to present the program.
Good afternoon and welcome. Revision, the act of looking back, of seeing with fresh eyes, of entering an old text from a new critical direction, is for us more than a chapter in our cultural history. It is an act of survival. We need to know the writing of the past and to know it differently than we have ever known it. These, of course, are the words of Adrienne Rich in her now classic 1971 address to the Modern Language Association, which she subsequently published in several different versions as an essay, When We Dead Awaken, Writing as Revision. And we were thinking about this essay when at the Institute for Research on Women and Gender last year, we conceived of this series on feminist classics. We were thinking about Rich's passionate insistence on reading and rereading as a strategy of survival for women and for feminism. And in fact, Adrienne Rich opened our series on feminist classics, which we're co-sponsoring with the library, with a reading from her new book of poems. But why feminist classics? Is that a contradiction in terms? Arguably, Rich's poems and essays, or Hazel Carby's Reconstructing Womanhood that we considered last fall, or Carol Smith Rosenberg's essay, The Female World of Love and Ritual, that we also revisited last year, or, for that matter, Erica John's Fear of Flying, are certainly not yet old texts that we want to enter from a new critical direction. Why reread them already? Isn't this part of our millennial obsession with memory, with looking backward rather than looking ahead, with a culture of reassessments, revisions, revivals everywhere around us? And of course, as I look around the room, I see your 50s dresses and your 60s long hair and your 70s high boots and leggings and wedge heels. We're performing the archive, Richard Schechner has said, of the contemporary theater scene, implying that we're turning back to the radical innovations of the past because we don't have an avant-garde, we don't have a radical theater of our own in our own age. One could see it that way, but I'd like to say that maybe something else is maybe that's going on, but maybe something else is going on here as well. We're not alone in revisiting the feminism of the 1970s. In fact, yesterday there was a conference at the New School on feminism across the generations, asking some very similar questions that we're asking today. So something is going on here, and I'd like to say that rereading, it precisely is not just a form of survival. Rereading certainly, survival certainly is a pertinent concept when one thinks of classics, but I'd like to see rereading as a move to the future. Fear of Flying was published 35 years ago. It tells the story of a young woman who graduates from Barnard in the early 1960s, who enters Columbia Graduate School in the late 1960s. Her literary education is to read books by men. She reads them, as does her author, carefully, scrupulously, to figure out how to write herself out of the plots in which they enclose her. And Rich said that to us. She said that we must reread the works of the past, not to pass on a tradition, but to break its hold over us. And this indeed is what Fear of Flying does. It was not until 1987 that Columbia, now coeducational, founded the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, following Barnard by Barnard's Center for Research on Women by many, many years. Today, we're celebrating the 35th anniversary of Fear of Flying, and indeed the 20th anniversary of the Institute for Research on Women and Gender. We've been, we're just initiating a series of celebratory panels to mark this milestone, really, in the history of Columbia. These moments are milestones. They're milestones in a trajectory, a history in Rich's terms of bold and courageous acts of survival. And if we reconsider that trajectory today, it's indeed not to break its hold over us, but to pass it on. What has happened to the feminism of the 1970s and the 1980s? What aspects of it have survived? How meaningful are they to the young women and men of today? Well, what we've done this afternoon is bring together writers, scholars, and critics, avid readers and rereaders of several generations, to revisit Fear of Flying at 35, and to use the occasion to think about the possibilities of subversion that might be open to women writers today. Together, we want to ask what makes a classic and for whom. But if you're wondering if Fear of Flying is a classic, you only have to read this week's newspapers. Michael has already mentioned Frank Rooney's column, Sex Lives, Fear of Not or Flying, The Sex Lives of Others, which was illustrated in the Week in Review last Sunday, which was illustrated with a classic photo by Edward Steichen. Or you might not have read yesterday's New York Post, the column by Liz Smith, which thanks to Paige Jackson I found, which reads, "Bigamy is having one husband too many. Monogamy is the same." Nobody seems to know who said this, but Erica Jong made it popular back in the 70s when she wrote Fear of Flying. Now, isn't that what a classic is? When the name of a writer or a literary work or an artwork has become a concept that's able to name something that could not otherwise be named. Dickensian, Kafkaesque, Proustian, Catch-22, Fear of Flying. But that name used in shorthand like that, Fear of Flying, the zipless fuck, can be a form of forgetting rather than remembering, because behind it is a work to be read and reread, to be thought about carefully in its own time and from the vantage point of today. So I think that if we propose to do this afternoon, it's not just out of nostalgia for the feminism of the 1970s, but as a measure of what it can tell us about a feminism for tomorrow. I'd like to end my introduction with thanks. I want to thank the Columbia University Libraries, and particularly Mike O'Brien and Matt Hempel, for making this event possible, for dedicating themselves to collecting the works of women, and manuscripts that will be useful to the scholars and readers of the future. And we've had a wonderful collaboration all year, and we hope it will continue. I'd like to thank the Barnard Center for Research on Women, with whom we collaborate all the time at the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, and my colleague Kampen, who's here. I'd like to thank our wonderful staff at the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, Paige Jackson and Veena Tran, who are here, and our graduate fellows, who will be here all afternoon, and my colleagues who agreed to moderate today's panels, Natalie Kampen, Margot Jefferson, and Jenny Davidson. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and most of all, I'd like to thank Erica Jong for bringing us all together. So I'd like to invite the first panel to come up to the table. And you know who you are: Rubin Suleiman, Shelley Fishkin, Rubin Sweeney, Natalie.
Thank you so much for being here. I come before you as a representative of the Center for Research on Women at Barnard College, which is one of the co-sponsors of this event. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you the three speakers. I'm going to say just a word or two about each one so that I don't take up the time that you actually want to spend with them. They are, first of all, right next to me, Rubin Suleiman. She's C. Douglas Dillon Professor of the Civilization of France and Comparative Literature at Harvard University. She's written extensively on the novel, on contemporary literature, on contemporary art. Her most recent book is called The Crisis of Memory and the Second World War. Beside her is Shelley Fisher Fishkin. She's professor of English and director of American Studies at Stanford University. She writes on American culture, particularly on race and ethnicity, on Mark Twain, and most recently on Paul Laurence Dunbar. Finally, at the greatest distance from me, is Yvonne Sweeney, director of the Center for the Humanities at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Most recently, she is the author of the 2007 novel with the glorious title, among other things, I've taken up smoking. I thank her for bringing us a title that's in the same week with Fear of Flying. Our first speaker, I believe, is Susan.
Yeah.
That is so. Rubin Suleiman, help me to welcome her, please.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be back on Morningside Heights. I think many of us have ties to Barnard and Columbia. So, okay, well, happy birthday. Girl Flying is just a bit younger than my older son, Michael, who will turn 38 next month. Michael came over for dinner last week, and I told him I was rereading the novel. And incidentally, the title of this talk is On Rereading Girl Flying at 35. So I told him I was rereading the novel for this birthday conference. Oh yeah, he said, I remember the cover. It was kind of yellowish, and it showed a half-naked woman. It made quite an impression on me when I was 6 or 7. He remembered seeing the book lying around the house, a small paperback with a shiny cover. I showed him the cover of the current New American Library edition, and he said, nope, it was less arty than this. Unfortunately, we had no way of comparing since my old copy was lost. I'd been looking for it everywhere without success. But then Marianne sent me the poster for the conference, which is on the program, which has a picture of that first paperback, the 1974 Signet edition. Same body, same zipper, but the zipper on that cover belonged to a silky, slightly creased, flesh-colored piece of clothing that one could imagine being worn, whereas in the current version there are no creases, only a light, flat wash. Is that why Michael called it arty? Or maybe he had just gotten older, but he had found memorably sexy as a 7-year-old now appeared to him simply as art. You can never step into the same river twice, as Heraclitus said, nor can you be who you were 3 decades ago. As a counterpoint to this little lesson in the futility of nostalgia, I suddenly remember the narrator of Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu reminiscing as an elderly man about a book he had read as a child. Coming upon a copy of the book again so many years later, he's transported back into a past he had thought long dead when he read it for the first time. The book brings back not only memories, but the actual feelings and dreams and even the sights and smells that surrounded him while reading, as if the intervening years had melted away. And this is the premise on which Proust's huge, magnificent novel is built, that one can negate the passage of time, recapture lost time through the power of sudden reminiscence, and above all through the power of writing about it. As for me, I'm torn between Heraclitus and Proust in this matter of reading. In Proustian mode, I remember as if it was yesterday when I first came across Erica John's novel, or more exactly, of a review of it. I had known the author as Erica Mann in a writing class we both attended at Barnard in the spring of 1960, taught by the poet Robert Pack. Erica was pretty and blonde, a talented poet, a freshman when I was a senior. I was not a talented poet, though I did manage to produce a rather ponderous sonnet that semester, whose first lines I still remember, more or less. Heaviness in moving guise, the river heaves seaward and greets quietly the dawn. We had some discussion in the class over that grammatical inversion, greets quietly. Why not just say quietly greets, everyone asked. But I was stubborn, and it didn't change. I was living in a dorm room at the time that had a partial view of the Hudson, and I spent many hours looking out at the water that spring. My father had died of a heart attack a few months earlier, and I was mourning him in my way, not very successfully. Sadness, solitude, uncertainty about the future, where would I be after graduation, all seemed to come together in that image of the heavy river moving toward the sea. I was not able to write about my feelings directly. Now fast forward to 1973. I am married, the mother of a 3-year-old boy, an assistant professor of French at Columbia College, one of the first women, actually, hired for that post, as I always tell people, spending a year sabbatical in Paris with my family, unable to write the book I need to get me tenure. It's a miserable year, despite the glories of Paris. I feel hopeless, trying to master the intricacies of structural analysis so that I, too, can write like that with scientific precision. One day that fall, or maybe the early spring of '74, opening the International Herald Tribune, I come across an article that blows me away. Erica Mann, now John, has published an autobiographical novel, a novel that uses words like cunt and fuck with no hesitation at all. A few years earlier, during another year in Paris, I had read Portnoy's Complaint, which also blew me away. Fear of Flying, judging by that article in the Tribune, seemed to be a female version of Roth's book, raunchy and uninhibited, daring to take risks I never could. It seemed I couldn't even write a piece of academic prose, never mind fuck or cunt. I'd like to say that I ran right out and bought the book in one of the English language bookstores in Paris, but if my son Michael's memories are right, it was the mass market paperback, not the original hardback, that was my first edition. Proust actually says that true first editions are the copies in which you read a book for the first time. Most likely, I read the book in Los Angeles around 1976. My husband and I both had good teaching jobs there, and I was finally becoming seriously interested in feminism and in writing by women. The most uninhibited, delicious, erotic novel a woman ever wrote, declared the blurb on the cover of the paperback. This sexy come-on was immediately followed by a quote from John Updike, guarantor of literary value. A winner, he had written, in the New Yorker, no less. But enough searching for lost time and first editions a la Proust. Giving Heraclides his due, I want to talk now about rereading Fear of Flying. Not in the past, not even a year ago, but now, in 2008. Like many people who first read it long ago, and maybe like many who had only heard about it, what I recalled of the novel before opening it again was sexual liberation, the literary right to use four-letter words, and the existential right to freely practice the activities those words denoted, like the one alluded to by the zipper on the cover. What Helen Gurley Brown had done for the great mass of women when she turned Cosmo into a household word, I told myself, Erica Jong had done for highbrow women, or those aspiring to be, who wouldn't be caught dead buying a magazine they could read sheepishly while waiting at the checkout line in the supermarket, that's Cosmo, but who did subscribe to Ms. Magazine. And the first issue of Ms. came out about a year and a half before Fear of Flying. The solidity with which Fear of Flying is associated in popular mythology with sex and more sex, even in the minds of people who may never have read the book, was confirmed, and now you had two allusions to it already. Here's the third, that article in the Sunday Times, the fear of not flying, whose whole point was that was about the ease with which some governors of large states engage in sexual adventures is enough to make monogamists feel positively envious. So it was time to reread the famous book. What did I discover? Well, it still is raunchy and exhilaratingly frank about things that many women don't talk about, not even with their best friends, Sex and the City notwithstanding. But I want to mention 2 or 3 things I have completely forgotten about the book, and which strike me today as interesting. First, there is a chapter about Germany, titled Near the Black Forest. As you may recall, but as I did not, Isadora and her husband Bennett spent several years in Heidelberg at the beginning of their marriage in the mid-1960s, while Bennett was serving in the army as a doctor. Isadora starts writing columns for a local publication, at first doing, superficial fluff pieces, but eventually becoming obsessed with hunting down traces of the Third Reich. She finds a Nazi amphitheater tucked away in the hills, which no one ever mentions, and which has been literally blotted out from the guidebooks. She discovers that the local library has gone to the trouble of pasting little oak-tagged squares over passages in a guidebook from 1937, so that not only collective memory of the past, but the historical record of it as well has been censored. Isadora writes an indignant column castigating hypocrisy and demanding the truth. The editor of the little publication publishes the article, but he tells her that she's wrong to think she's doing the local population a favor. The Germans loved Hitler, he said quietly. If they were to be honest, you wouldn't like what you would hear. Even they don't know their real feelings. If they were honest, you would hate it worse than hypocrisy. Isadora ponders these words as she struggles to be more honest in her own writing. Quote, I have pasted imaginary oak patches over certain areas of my life, she realizes. She would have to tear them off if she wanted to be a genuine writer. This insight is important to the Bildungsroman theme of the novel, and can also be read as an indirect commentary, or as we say in the trade, meta-commentary, on this very book with its insistence on frankness and four-letter words. But as a reader in 2008, I note with some wonderment that fictional writing about Germany's troubled relations to its Nazi past was still a relatively rare thing in 1973. Even writing about the Holocaust was not as plentiful or as well known then as it would become just a few years later. Elie Wiesel's Night was not yet required reading in the public schools, and Primo Levi was almost unknown in the United States. Last but not least, the so-called memory boom in literary and historical studies, which is concerned with the way that individuals and nations recall or refuse to recall their past, had not even begun, let alone become the flourishing academic field that it is today. It therefore gives me a jolt to realize that Fear of Flying dealt with the theme of German collective memory 35 years ago. Not in great detail, but not cursorily either. And to realize as well that I have completely forgotten that fact. Number two, Isadora, who is such a mocker of psychoanalysts, from her first shrink in New York, Dr. Schrift, who is short, of course, as I noted in New Yorker piece, to her last one, on whom she walks out, not to mention her husband, the depressive Bennett, and her no-good lover, Adrian Goodlove. She's a inveterate punner, Isadora. Isadora then ends up with an insight that is nothing if not psychoanalytic. On the train from Paris to London, in the last chapter, when a lascivious conductor offers to fulfill the fantasy she has harbored for years, she screams at him in indignation and disgust. "You pig!" I spat out. A little later, safely ensconced in a crowded compartment, it dawns on her, quote, how funny that episode had been. My zipless fuck, my stranger on a train. Here I'd been offered my very own fantasy, and instead of turning me on, it had revolted me. Fantasy is one thing, reality another. Dreaming and writing are not the same as acting out, and are a lot more satisfying in the long run. Could any shrink wish for a more sane and healthy conclusion? Erica Jong, in a conversation published as part of the Reader's Guide to the current paperback edition, remarks that she never thought of Fear of Flying as, quote, a book about sex. I thought it was a book about freedom. Now, this might strike people who equate flying with the other F word and nothing else as odd, even perhaps disingenuous. But if we take Isadora's concluding insight about fantasy versus reality seriously, it makes perfectly good sense. What many readers and non-readers forget is that the zipless fuck never happens. When Isadora expects it, with the gorgeous Langian Goodlove, he is unable to deliver. And when a delivery is offered, she refuses in a huff. Maybe the train conductor is too lowly to play the male role in her fantasy. Maybe if he had been gorgeous and upper class, she would not have refused him. But John does not give Isadora that option. Instead, what we have in the end is another psychoanalytic insight. Quote, people don't complete us. We complete ourselves. Isadora states several times that she is, despite all her raunchiness, a good girl of the 50s. In some ways, I think she's right. Isadora has the mind of a moralist. But that may also be why John's book continues to be read. On my way into New York the other day, as I sat with the book on my lap on the train, the young woman on the seat opposite me smiled at me. That's a great book, she said. I perked up. Have you read it? I asked her. Yes, she had, she answered. And what did she think of it? Does it deal with issues that still matter to women after all these years? Oh yes, she said, most definitely. So it looks like the questions of 35 years ago, of women's possibilities and sense of self, of their relations to men, oscillating between servility and bitchiness, as Isadora puts it, have not yet been fully resolved. The third thing I have forgotten about Fear of Flying is this. 35 years ago, a psychoanalytic session in New York, cost $40.
Thank you, Susan. Shelley, would you? Take that, Susan.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Institute for Research on Women and Gender and the Center for Research on Women and Columbia Libraries for bringing all of us together. But most of all, I'd like to thank Erica John for giving us so much to celebrate. I was fairly late coming to writing by women because, as my friend the late Lillian Robinson put it, I'd had all the disadvantages of a first-class Yale education, which meant that the only woman writer who made it onto the syllabus of my intensive honors seminar in 1969 was Virginia Woolf. I loved writing myself, almost as much as I loved reading, but the fact that the only woman writer on the syllabus had committed suicide was unsettling, to say the least. Then, a month before graduation, a novel called The Bell Jar was published in the U.S., and a friend who knew that I'd written articles in college for one of the same magazines that Plath had written for gave me a copy. I devoured it in large gulps. At last, a book by an American woman that insisted on showing us the world through her eyes. And it was a world that I could recognize. I found Plath's candor and dry irony exciting. As an aspiring young woman writer, I was hungry for stories about other aspiring young women writers, particularly about one who had gone to hell and back and had lived to tell the tale, as Esther Greenwood, the book's protagonist, had. Only then I found out that Esther Greenwood's creator hadn't lived to tell the tale, but instead had taken her life a month after the book was published. Not every smart writer in America met that fate, I reassured myself. What about Susanna Rosen, the author of one of America's first national bestsellers, or Kate Chopin, or Edith Wharton? Weren't they all successful writers who hadn't taken their own lives? And hadn't they all created heroines who dared to color outside the lines before they killed them off? It was depressing. Why didn't all these smart women writers write about women like themselves, who broke the rules in their own lives and kept on living and writing? Can women be writers, I wondered, if they're not willing to sacrifice their own lives or the lives of their heroines in the process? Around that time, I remember my parents asking me who my role model was as a writer. I startled them by answering, Oriana Fallaci. She was the only woman writer I knew who questioned the boundaries that circumscribed not only other women writers, but male writers as well, and she was still breathing and perpendicular. As Isadora Wayne would put it some years later in How to Save Your Own Life, quote, all the great fiction of the modern age showed women falling for vile seducers and dying as a result. They died under breaking waves, under the wheels of trains. Someone had to shout once and for all, fly, and live to tell the tale, end quote. Well, that's what Erica John did in 1973 when she published Fear of Flying. The zipless fluff may have gotten all the press, but what excited me most about that book was that both Isadora and her author lived to tell the tale. For those of us who grew up longing to be writers in the 50s, John wrote later in Seducing the Demon, female writers didn't exist on our critical radar or were cruelly mocked. One critic, John tells us, announced to her writing class at Barnard, we had the sort of experiences that made writers. We didn't get drunk in bars in Pigalle or pick up hookers in seedy left bank hotels or run with the bulls in Pamplona. Our lives were too circumscribed. We were too ladylike, end quote. Fear of Flying was not ladylike. And as it burst onto the scene, it filled a vacuum. It filled it with a bawdy, Rabelaisian, female subject, just as confused and prone to make mistakes as the rest of us, but with a sense of humor and an abundance of chutzpah. Best of all, both she and her creator were very much alive. In 1972, the year before Fear of Flying came out, Joanna Russ published an essay entitled, What Can a Heroine Do, or Why Women Can't Write, in which she stated flatly, quote, that an examination of English literature or Western literature reveals that of all the possible actions people can do in fiction, very few can be done by women. Our literature is not about women. It is not about women and men equally. It is by and about men. Women, as they so often appear, are just women's roles as imagined by men, end quote. Charlotte Perkins Gilman had done variations on the same theme more than a half-century earlier in her book, Our Androcentric Culture, or Man-Made World. 90% of fiction, Gilman wrote, is, quote, adventures of him in pursuit of her, and he stops when he gets her. The love of our stories is man's love of woman. If any dare dispute this and say it treats equally of women's love for man, I answer, then why do the stories stop at marriage? Women's love for man, as currently treated in fiction, is the way he wants her to feel, expects her to feel, not a fair representation of how she does feel, end quote. Gilman's comment here resonates with something Esther Greenwood says in The Bell Jar. Reflecting on an article her mother clipped from Reader's Digest and mailed her at college, quote, the article was written by a married woman lawyer with children and called In Defense of Chastity. It gave all the reasons a girl shouldn't sleep with anybody but her husband, and then only after they were married. Now, the one thing this article didn't seem to me to consider, Plath wrote, was how a girl felt, end quote. Before Fear of Flying, being scrupulously honest about how a girl felt, about sex, about writing, about the contradictions that riddled her efforts to figure out who she was supposed to be, was too often the prelude to an early demise, either for the character or the woman who dared to give her voice. No wonder Isadora Wing caused such a sensation. Here was a woman in a novel struggling, before our very eyes, with some of the same feelings and impulses and bravura and hesitation and daring and doubt that her readers struggled with themselves. She was embracing her body with the same audacity that Walt Whitman had embraced his. She was giving herself the freedom of choice that men in fiction had long taken as their birthright, but that had usually spelled doom for women. She made mistakes and suffered some long nights of the soul, but she bounced back and didn't do away with herself. Fear of Flying claimed for women something that men had long enjoyed, the freedom to make mistakes, to be bold and transgressive and wrong, and nonetheless to live to tell the tale. So what about today? Is Fear of Flying hopelessly dated? Thank goodness much of what was revolutionary in 1973 is dated today. But some of the attitudes that Isadora pioneered in expressing 35 years ago still haven't disappeared. Take her belief that she did not have to be submissive, dutiful, and miserable in her marriage. Do many women today buy into their obligation to be submissive and dutiful where husbands are concerned, even if they're miserable? Of course they do, as statistics on domestic violence underline. Or take the permission Isadora gave herself to value her own sexual desire and pleasure in a world which defined both sex and pleasure as they were understood by men. Are women's sexual desires considered as important as men's today? The number of advertisements and films that glorify men's sexual desire dwarf those celebrating women's desire. Women are still usually presented as sex objects, the pursued rather than the pursuer. Recall that even in Sex and the City, the one female character who embraced her sexuality wholeheartedly is also the one character in the series who's punished with breast cancer. Or take Isadora's resentment that her calculus of desire was inordinately shaped by commercial products that exploited her insecurities. Is that still going on today? Absolutely. As Isadora lamented, quote, growing up female in America, what a liability. What litanies the advertisers of the good life chanted at you. What curious catechisms. Blush like you mean it. Love your hair. That shine on your face should come from him, not your skin. If you're concerned about douching. But all the ads seem to imply that if you were only narcissistic enough, if only you took proper care of your smells, your air, your boobs, your eyelashes, your armpits, your crotch, you would meet a beautiful, powerful, potent, and rich man who would satisfy every longing and fly you to the moon, where you would live totally satisfied forever. And the crazy part of it was that even if you were clever, even if you spent your adolescence reading John Donne and Shaw, it didn't matter. You were brainwashed all the same. End quote. Anyone who thinks that has changed much only need pick up one of a dozen women's magazines on the newsstand today, or watch Jean Kilburn's film Killing Me Softly, or read her book Can't Buy My Love, or watch one of her lectures on the internet. Women today still need Isadora Wing's chutzpahdik self-invention, her energy and her ebullience, her refusal to let others define and pigeonhole her, her determination to be a writer on her own terms. What Isadora really wants, she tells us during a particularly self-aware moment, is to give birth to herself. And isn't that still one of the key challenges of being a woman today? Fear of Flying came out years before the movement to validate and recover women's text took off. Isadora, quote, learned about women from men and saw them through the eyes of male writers. I languished in utter frustration, Isadora tells us, thinking that the subjects I knew about were trivial and feminine, while the subjects I knew nothing of were profound and masculine. No matter what I did, I felt I was bound to fail. Either I would fail by writing or fail by not writing. I was paralyzed, end quote. But writing lures her nonetheless. Quote, I thought of my used red electric typewriter sitting in New York, and a pang of yearning went through me. That was who I loved. I could see myself going back to Bennett for the sake of having custody of the typewriter, end quote. As she thinks about her writing during a particularly bleak night spent in conversation with herself, she says, quote, think of Sylvia Plath, and responds, dead. Who wants a life or death like hers, even if you become a saint, end quote. Fear of Flying showed another way of being a woman writer in the world. It modeled a vision in which, quote, everything human was imperfect and ultimately absurd. What did I believe in then? In humor? In laughing at systems? At people? At oneself? In laughing even at one's own need to laugh all the time? In seeing life as contradictory, many-sided, funny, tragic, and with moments of outrageous beauty, end quote. Fear of Flying paved the way for a new generation of writers. For wonderful books like Min Jin Lee's Free Food for Millionaires and Evan Sweeney's, among other things, I Kick It Up Smoking. Books that see women not as reflected in the mirrors placed by men, but on their own terms. The candor and honesty and the earthiness and wit and energy and affirmation that characterize their work are part of what we get to harvest from seeds that Fear of Flying planted. It's a good harvest. It's important to be grateful to a work like Fear of Flying that helped engender it and create an atmosphere in which it could live and breathe and thrive in our world today. It's possible that someday, in the future, there may come a time when the conflicts and challenges that animate Fear of Flying will strike readers as preposterously dated. When that time comes, the novel will provide the historian with invaluable information about that time in the distant past when women felt bold if they recognized and acted on their sexual impulses, but men felt normal. When achieving a sense of self independent of a partner of the opposite sex was harder for women than men. Until that time, however, John's willingness to grapple with these and other issues will continue to pull readers into her orbit. Thank you very much.
I do apologize because I actually, and this hasn't happened to me for years, but I had a computer problem. So not only am I the only writer here who I'm not used to giving academic papers, but I'm out my writing. So this should be hopefully relatively smooth, but bear with me when it's not. I've had to just kind of scrawl an entire new paper in the last 45 minutes. So here I am. But I wanted to start out just by saying thanks to Marianne for inviting me here, and it's really an honor to be here with all these speakers. When I first got an invitation to talk about this book, the person I thought of right away was my mother. I am actually your son's age. So I was about 7 when I saw this on my mother's bedside table. And I vividly remember the cover, just as Susan Suleiman's son did, in exactly this paperback version with the sexy zippered cutaway of flesh here. I accepted this invitation as if my older sister had just beckoned me in there to sneak and explore, because in fact I'd never read the book. My mother is also approximately Joan's age. She was brought up in a kind of WASPy equivalent to Joan's upper middle class family. But when she was 21, she converted Catholicism to marry a young Irishman, my father. And by the time she was 28, she had 4 children. All of us were mistakes, and I heard her describe actually the sequence of mistakes over a couple of glasses of white wine one time with a man I didn't know. It was the rhythm method for the first 2 because they were still seeing a priest then, and then I was conceived while she was using a diaphragm, and then finally my sister while she was on the pill, which was followed by an abortion and finally tubal ligation. She and my father actually spent most of the sexually liberating 60s and 70s changing diapers, as you can imagine. But they did have the joy of sex tucked away in their closet, which, needless to say, I discovered. The Joy of Sex had been on the bestseller list for about a year when Fear of Flying came out. It was, on the top 10 of the New York Times bestseller list for almost 3 years, 70 weeks or something. So really, a lot of my anticipatory excitement in reading The Fear of Flying was actually was a vision of those illustrations from Joy of Sex, those hairy men in Joy of Sex. I felt that I was definitely going to discover them in this novel, and which in fact I did. When I finally read it, I have to say that half my mind was kind of 7 years old, looking for that cover and those sort of dirty words. I didn't even know to really look for a sex scene then. And then half my mind was kind of with my mother, trying to kind of discover what it was like to be trapped by 4 children in the kind of lusty 70s. But what I found was neither the lurid fantasy that would have kind of blown my 8-year-old mind, or really the lurid fantasy that I had imagined my mother taking sustenance in, but a kind of anxious internal monologue about the difficulty of marriage, strewn with flaccid penises and outdated Indian shirts and electric hair setters and quaintly kind of alienated psychological terms, of course, which have become absolutely a part of our vocabulary. I kept kind of, as I was reading, looking back incredulously at the cover to confirm my sort of titillated childhood memory with that fleshy slice of nakedness, and to read the blurb that Susan Suleiman already read by John Updike, the most uninhibited, delicious, erotic novel a woman ever wrote. And I found myself kind of surprisingly infuriated. Where was all this great sex? And where were those illustrations that I vaguely remembered from sneaking into my parents' bedroom? So it took me a while to figure out what got me so mad. And only slightly, I guess, kind of slightly less outdated psychological vocabulary allowed me to follow my anger back to its source. And very helpfully, I thought about a couple of reasons that I was frustrated in reading this again. It was primarily, of course, there's the idea that much of the frustration is kind of deliberate, that it's empathetic and that it's motivating, and that the heroine Isadora is ruled by frustration. She's dolefully aware that she and her flaccid male lovers are not rising to the occasion. She wants more with us, and each time Isadora gets under that sort of dusty chintz bed cover that John keeps coming back to, we feel the kind of smothering weight of historical obligation and the inevitability of kind of bourgeois cowardice and the surprising creakiness of social change, and that's frustrating. And this is frustrating in a good way. This is what kind of those of us who learned our feminism almost by rote in the 80s really idealized about the feminism of the 70s, that there was this frustration, there was this really organic, ready to bloom anger. So that's one thing that I would absolutely credit the book with. I also realized, and this was really strange for me, and I think this is an experience which reading is absolutely supposed to give you, which is a kind of look in the mirror, which is that Joan was writing, just as I was reading, for both her childhood self and for her mother's kind of unlived self. You know, it startled me in the end of the book when Isadora is kind of hitting proverbial rock bottom, the rock bottom that she'd been sort of promised by her lover. And she can only think to describe his dumping in her as being 6 and having your bicycle smashed by your supposed best friend. Now, this kind of like infantile description of this moment in the book, which is at the very end, so you think that this is where she's supposed to be sort of at her most mature, made perfect sense to me, because in fact, it is kind of the infuriating perspective of middle age, which is in fact really neither here nor there. It's sort of fueled by the maddening kind of indignations of youth and the sort of weathered tolerances of age. This is in fact the perspective that I have now. And it took me reading this book to understand that actually, that middle age is this hard place where our childhood revelations are still really fresh to us, and we're waiting for the ones that are going to be conclusive in our older age. And in fact, they're only as reliable as the childhood ones. So we're shuttling back and forth, and that in itself is a frustration and a revelation. Finally, it was not until I got to the end of the book, the very end, where the heroine is having a series of kind of enlightening dreams after she's finally been canned by her lover, and she's kind of in this purgatory. She's about to kind of go back to her husband, and she, in the final one, a black version of the writer Colette tells her that she's graduating, and she's up on the sort of podium, and there's a person getting, this black Colette is going to give her the sort of the scroll for graduation, and she suddenly understands that the only way she's going to graduate is, and Colette doesn't exactly say this to her, but is to make love to Colette in public. And suddenly, this sort of surprising solicitation brought home to me what I was actually looking for in the book, and what I was, terminally frustrated not to find. But that's a lesbian. I guess, having just published my first novel this past summer, which is a lesbian novel, although, there were, at this point in time, we've kind of gotten past having gay bookshelves in bookstores, and now, in fact, one of the reviews called my novel post-gay fiction. The idea being that we're beyond these categories. I have been in this past bunch of years looking very adamantly for a role model, and also trying to kind of discover where the lesbian writers of my age have gone to. Curiously, John actually does mention a few lesbian writers in the beginning of the book. She mentions Carson McCullers and Virginia Woolf, and it's this is a place that I'm going to lose my place. And in a list of what she calls shy, shrinking, and schizoid women who are timid in their lives and brave only in their art. Let's see. Apologies for this. Essentially, what I'm trying to get to is that gay writers have kind of lost the thread a little bit. Willa Cather won the Pulitzer Prize in 1923 for her fiction, and Elizabeth Bishop for her poetry in 1956. But somehow the gay liberation brought women out of the closet, brought gay authors out of the closet, but also somehow away from a literary tradition, a kind of traditional novel form. And I was really impressed, and this is finally where I'm going to land, at how John was able to stay actually within the traditional novel form and to make so many puns and so many plays, in fact, engage in so many ways with a literary tradition, and still really clearly move away from it. That's not something that a lot of gay writers have been able to do in this century. Often it seems that there's a totally countercultural gay narrative, or there is a very conventional one, like the ones on TV, like L Word. So what I found in her actually is this model of a real breakaway moment, and that was very exciting to me. So that's why I'm going to leave it. Thank you.
And I never saw the part. I'm very interested in Holocaust history. I never saw the part about the Holocaust. Is it on? It's terrible. Oh, hold it closer. Okay. I don't. Oh, my name is Nancy Newman. And I am referring to the Holocaust part that you spoke about. I did not see that in the book when I read it. Because, and I find it very peculiar that was your first point to make about a book like this. And you are wrong there. She was not the first writer to write about the Holocaust, and I really kind of resent that you're sort of comparing her to Primo Levi and Simon Wiesenthal as far as the Holocaust is revealed, is said.
Okay, you want me to answer that?
Sure.
Well, first of all, I did not say that this was about the Holocaust. It's about an even more interesting issue, which is the German memory of the Nazi period. That is what I wrote was that at that time that issue was almost never dealt with in anything. Number one. Number two, then I said, and by the way, even books on the Holocaust, such as the ones that we know that everyone now has read, even those were not all that commonly known in 1973. And of course, it wasn't the first one. Fear of Flying is not at all about the Holocaust at all. She mentions occasionally her Jewishness, and I don't even remember whether it mentions that if she had been in Europe, they wouldn't be here. But no, I think the book is even more interesting. It's not about that chapter called In the Black or Near the Black Forest. It's not about the Holocaust. It's about, as I said, about the German coming to grips with the Nazi past. And incidentally, historians, have shown that in Germany, it wasn't until the late 60s that you had any kind of attempt to even grapple with what happened, because although they had begun paying reparations to Jews who had survived, but who could show that they had been victimized. In fact, it was only with the generation of 68 in Germany, that is, the young people who were growing up, who were born after the war and coming of age in that turbulent period of 68, 69, those are the ones that demanded, like Andreas Heusen, wonderful colleague here at Columbia, I've often spoken to him about it, he's German, and he is of that generation, and they were the ones that demanded that their parents tell them what they were doing during the war. So, as I said, of course, this book is not about that, but I was quite taken with the fact that I had completely forgotten that chapter, and the fact that the heroine somehow, herself becomes so obsessed with that past, and that the way she digs back and finds that forgotten amphitheater on the outskirts of Heidelberg. I mean, it was really interesting for somebody like myself who has written quite a lot about the Holocaust and about memory of World War II, and I do know some of the literature, and I, of course, agree with you, it's not the first book, it's not even about the Holocaust, that was not my point.
Just to follow that and to agree with Susan, I also had not remembered that part. And it's very interesting because rereading the book now, I was reading it from the perspective of today, but also trying to remember what it was like to read it for the first time. And I realized that in 1973, even though, I'm a child of survivors and I was traveling in Europe in the late 60s and in the early 70s, I wasn't looking for those places at the time. I've started looking for that much, much later. And I think it's really, I was also really struck by that passage, and I think it says a lot about the character and what she's like and what she's, the kind of attention she pays to her surroundings, and the kind of, the Bildungsroman theme of the book, which is a Bildung about many, many things, not just sex. And it says a lot about the author and what it was like for an American Jewish woman to be in Europe at the time, which actually wasn't my experience because I wasn't coming from the U.S., but I wasn't looking for those places either in Germany or in France until really the 80s. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to make one comment on the Holocaust. I'm Erica John. Fear of Flying had a very hard time being published in many countries after it sold many millions of copies in the United States and Britain. The first French publisher to whom it was offered wanted to turn it down because he said French women don't need psychiatrists, they have French men. It was later published by Robert Laffont and sold maybe 500,000 copies in France because French women identified even though they had French men. But in Germany I had a most incredible experience in that Ullstein, which had been Henry Miller's publisher, wanted to publish it, but they demanded that I write a preface to it explaining that I didn't hate all Germans, that I did not think all Germans were Nazis, that my book was merely the view of an assimilated Jewish woman from New York City living in Germany. And I said to my agent, my then agent, I think it was Sterling Lord, I said, tell them no. If they don't want to publish the book, they don't have to publish the book. But I will not write an introduction saying that I really love Germans and blah, blah, blah. And frankly, between you and me, Sterling, let me just say that the feelings Isadora has in Heidelberg are the feelings of many young Jewish people going to Germany for the first time. And, I came from a family where my parents wouldn't buy a Mercedes if it were the last car in the world. I never went to synagogue, but I had a strong, passionate pride in being Jewish. I'm not from a family of survivors, but I will not write an introduction retreating from the insights in what is a novel. German publisher, it wasn't finally Ullstein, it was Fisher. We turned down Ullstein because of this absurd demand, and Fisher Verlag came forward, bought the book, required no introduction, and sold about 1 million copies of the book in Germany. I'm only saying this as a footnote to your discussion of the Holocaust Because even then, and I must be speaking of 1975 or so, there were publishers in Germany who did not want this book without an apologia at the front. And I think that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me? I'm Susanna Dow, and I have the distinct honor of being Erica's sister. I've always been thrilled at her success, and I love her very much. But Fear of Flying has been, and I'm listening to all of you and respect highly all the things you said. It has been a thorn in my flesh because it was an expose of my life at a time when I lived in Lebanon and was having a very difficult time being the sister of Erica Jong. And I really would like it to say this at this juncture, that I forgive Erica, but I also think people should understand prejudice has many forms. When you write a chapter called Arabs and Other Animals, and then you talk about the Holocaust and you talk about the Jewish sensibility, it's rather mind-boggling that you would write a chapter called Arabs and Other Animals referring to your brother-in-law and his family, who were Christian Arabs. And I think that people have to really be more even-handed and more self-critical and dig deeper into their motivations and the things they do and the way they talk about other people. And I think it is symptomatic. As a Jew, I know the position of being a Jew, but as an Arab, a Lebanese, I also know the position of being having prejudice and being hurt very, very deeply. So I think that this book, to me, speaks of all those things, and it also speaks of resentment and cruelty to family, which I once heard people like Jhumpa Lahiri, Edwige Danticat talk about the fact that they would think 1,000 times before they would implicate their families in a way as to embarrass them. And I've wanted to say this for many years, and I love my sister very much, but I've taken this platform to say it, and I hope that I have made some impression. Thank you.
My name is Karen Frank. I'm an environmental psychologist. I teach in a school of architecture. I don't write fiction yet, but I do write other more academic things. And I wanted to say just a few things, changing the topic a bit. It's very hard for me to place the book in today's world. I can only remember when I read it. And I think it's very interesting how many people who hadn't even read it remember when they saw the cover. So there's something about reading it at that time, for many of us, that's just incredibly significant. I mean, I'm getting goosebumps. I was quite independent at the time. I lived alone. I'm in New York. I was in graduate school. My parents were very much in favor of my being in graduate school. There was no pressure on me to get married. I had a full and satisfying sex life, all of that. And yet, it still made such a difference. And I think that's very interesting, that I had all these things going for me, and yet to read two things. To read about a person I admired in the book, and to read a book written by a woman that was like that, had that double-edged quality that was just amazing. And I'm really sorry today that I can't quite capture what that was like. I have to say the other book I read at the time was Doris Lessing's Golden Notebook, and also I had forgotten completely that my father gave me a copy of The Joy of Sex for Christmas, much to my mother's disgruntlement. So all of those things came together in an incredible way at that time. And I just wanted to say that as a kind of appreciation, but also to note that it isn't just nostalgia, that if I were to write some history of my own life, I'd have to get at what that moment was. And some of the things that were mentioned about the 70s feminism and this just about ready to boil over and not knowing what words to use was really significant as well. Thank you very much,
Erica. My name is Sari Cooper, and I'm a sex therapist and couples therapist. And I hadn't read the book till this year because I was invited to a book club to sort of be an expert around the sexual issues that were brought up in the book. And I had very similar feelings around the book because part of me remembers that time as a child, and I never had seen it. And I saw The Joy of Sex. I didn't see this book in the bookshelves. So part of me really felt like the child in that time. So even though I hadn't read the book, I had those experiences of remembering that time and seeing my older sister with her struggles and all of that, and sort of the messages that were sent, because that's what I do. I ask people what messages they were sent, and verbally and non-verbally, about sex. So I really did appreciate Isadora's struggle and going through psychoanalysis, having gone through it myself, and appreciating her struggle. But when I brought that to the book club, many members of the book club were maybe 10 years younger than me. And there was really a separation in the reactions, and that was very interesting for me to see, because some of the women just felt like, so what's the big deal? Like, we say those words now, and I really had to set this historical context for them, because I think some of them really didn't appreciate how difficult and revolutionary some of these ideas to be spoken aloud were. And yet there were some women in the group, in fact, some of the women who were single really got it, like really appreciated it, because they really felt like some of those double standards are very much alive today, and they're out in the dating world and all of that, and how some of their married women friends sort of peek in and say, oh, what's it really like? And think that it's so wonderful. And, and they were very frank about all the sort of double standards that are expected from them as a woman out there dating in the world today. So I just sort of wanted to give that perspective in terms of history and from the therapist's point of view, and also different generations.
I'm Maristella Lorch, teacher. I had Eric as a student at Barnard College. And I would like to make an observation, because I have followed Erica through the years. First of all, Fear of Flying should be considered a book which broke the ice for Erica, not only to America, but to the whole world. It is wrong to look at it simply as a reaction to what we had in New York City. I also, yes, I remember being with Erica on a gondola in Venice. I don't remember the year, Erica, but as soon as you got in, and I said to the gondoliere that was the girl of whom I was so proud because she had written among other things, Fear of Flying. The man almost fell into the Laguna because he didn't know what to do to Erica. This was an ignorant gondoliere in Venice. So I appreciate Erica for having been broken the ice as a writer to the wide world with that particular book. The other thing I wanted to say is that I followed Erica and all the rest of the production, a very rich production that shows what type of writer Erica is. I don't go into details of appreciation, but I would say that not only all of us, but her own family should be proud of Erica and what she has done. Thank you.
I'm Elaine Showalter. I had two things that I wanted to say. One is that since we're talking about the book and the editions of this book, what I have brought with me are the original galleys, which I was sent by Erica's editor back before the book came out, and I've kept the letter. Erica had signed it in her characteristic purple ink scrawl, and the accompanying letter says, very interesting thing when you get these promotional letters about a book. The editor said, "We think this is an important novel." That was how it was. That was how it arrived, and that was how it previewed. And I remember reading it in galleys, and realizing immediately that it was so important. It's the only, I've given away really thousands of books in my life as I've moved. This is one book that I will never give away and have always kept. I always also wanted to say that I've just finished writing a history of American women writers from 1650 to 2000. And there's a novelist, a poet I write about in the 1850s, Julia Ward Howe, who you know for writing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. What people don't know is that Julia Ward Howe's first book was called Passion Flowers. And it was an extraordinary book of poems that she published anonymously, which was more or less suppressed by her husband because it was autobiographical. And at that time, he said to her, either you stop writing and you never publish anything like this again, or I will take custody of the children. She writes to her sisters that she agreed to this deal. She gave in and was immediately again pregnant and ended up with 6 children. And what I say in the book is, by the end, isn't it wonderful in the year 2000 that women do not have to have permission to use their lives as material anymore?
I'm Anka Legutka. I'm a graduate student at Columbia, and I'd like to offer just a brief comment of perspective of a person who is reading the book for the first time now. And I have to say that even though we feminists of today take so much, take the achievement of the feminists of the 70s and 80s for granted, I'm just so amazed how relevant this book it is. I'm 30. I'm in the 5th year of marriage in grad school, and it's just a book like speaking to me so much, the book I was looking for, so thank you.
Hi, I'm Joanna Lipper, and I'm the same age as the book. So it's been very exciting to read it and contemplate it in that way. I was also a student of Rubin Suleiman, and my question is really about the humor in the book, because Ms. Sweeney talked about the organic, ready-to-bloom anger of the 70s, and I love Adrienne Rich and the power of that writing. And I was just wondering, Susan, I know you've done a lot on surrealism and women in surrealism, and the use of humor in feminist strategy and its link to anger as sort of a strategy, and if men embraced this book more at the time because of humor and how that functioned in terms of the reception of the book.
Well, actually, I did write a book called Subversive Intent, Gender, Politics, and the Avant-Garde, and there's a chapter in there on the politics and poetics of female eroticism, and I write about this book there as one of different ways that women writers have taken over the right to talk about their bodies. And I do mention, I think the humor, of course, is really, and I'm sure the other panelists will have things to say about it too. I think you all mentioned it. It really is outstanding, and not only the sort of irreverence of the heroine about so many things, including, unfortunately, I'm sure it can insult, especially if you feel that you're the brunt of it. You know, I mean, I could. Families are strange. Families must be handled very delicately, or something. But anyway, the humor that I noticed in that book when I wrote about it is also the self-irony. I mean, there's a lot of self-irony. It's not that Isadora pokes fun at others, but she's also, to a great extent, ironic about her own problems and conflict and everything else, and even about, she's just a very deliciously, not erotic, but deliciously, self-consciously ironic writer. And so she not only ironizes about others, but she also ironizes about herself. And I think that that's a very important aspect of the book.
I just wanted to add, I think it was actually the same year Fear of Flying came out, 1973, that there was a famous cover of Ms. Magazine. A man, it's in an Andy Warhol-style cartoon, and a man says to a woman, "Do you know the women's movement has no sense of humor?" And she responds, "No, but hum a few bars and I'll fake it." And I think the fact that this cover appears in 73 tells us that there really was this widespread assumption that humor and feminism don't mix. So it was very much a case to be proven, and I think one of the things that Fear of Flying did was suggest that, in fact, they can go together, and that humor and feminism are not adverse to one another.
I only just have to add that I was also really struck when I read the book, as I mentioned just briefly, but by the psychologizing language and how alien it seemed to be to even the author itself, but at the same herself, but then at the same time really beautifully integrated, and it really takes you back to a time when it wasn't just a natural part of our vocabulary, and that also was about her ability to really have a very fresh idea about sort of language and cynicism and irony that the language of psychology has dampened a little bit in our own daily lives, I think.
Thank you so much. I think what we'll do is break for coffee until 4 o'clock and begin again. So thank you very much to our speakers and to the presentation.